Many of us have lived with people we'd never choose as housemates. People we've found persistently disruptive, argumentative, fussy, tactless. We've endured everything from encroachment on personal space, to noise pollution, to unsolicited life coaching. Aggravating as this behavior might be, there's not necessarily any malice behind it. Maybe a degree of self-absorption or poor personal boundaries, but things tip over into abuse when the behavior becomes pervasively controlling and coercive. Control might mean tracking people's movements, forcing their attendance at events, monitoring their phone calls, texts, emails, governing their financial transactions, dictating their physical appearance, including clothes, hairstyles, body shape, deciding who they can and can't see, including forcing unwanted relationships on them, and sabotaging their independence. Coercive behavior can involve threats, real or implied, shaming and humiliation, raging, physical violence, and the destruction of property. Because of the corrosive impact of this behavior, targets are frequently advised to minimize or terminate contact with controlling, coercive individuals. It's a simple equation. Fewer encounters means fewer opportunities for abuse. But going low or no contact doesn't always feel possible. Many targets find themselves isolated in situations where they can't see an exit. Whether or not there actually are viable exits becomes a moot point if an individual isn't able to see them. To be achieved, they have to be perceived. Even when an exit emerges, targets sometimes find it suddenly blocked by factors beyond their control. I've received messages from individuals locked in with abusive fundamentalist families living in fear, or concerned about other relatives in that situation. Others are being subjected to raging aggression from disordered parents and partners. I want to look at the experience of living with abusers and offer some thoughts on dealing with the poison. In particular, I'll be looking at some key maladaptive habits to break and some positive habits to cultivate. It's important to make a realistic assessment of abusers. What abusive behaviors have you witnessed from them? Not just to you, but to others. Are there any you would class as dangerous? How's their impulse control? Do they demonstrate the capacity to calm themselves? Or do they ride their rage for all it's worth? Where there's a plausible physical threat, targets need to think seriously about taking decisive action. Targets who don't feel ready to call directly on law enforcement can access support and practical guidance from other confidential services. Each country will have its own. In the UK, organisations include Refuge, Women's Aid, Victim Support, Mankind Initiative, and Men's Advice Line. Sometimes targets shy away from action, fearing retribution. But action and inaction both have significant risks, and in many cases, the risks of doing nothing substantially outweigh the risks of doing something, as the abuser becomes more chaotic and lethal with age. When children are involved, the risks are further heightened. The threat of physical violence isn't always present. Sometimes the assault is psychological. Whatever form the abuse takes, it's important to break the silence. For targets who've been trained to hide their abuse from the outside world, silence becomes a conditioned reflex, a maladaptive habit. Aside from preventing targets reaching out for support, silence has a more insidious psychological effect. When something's rendered unspeakable, it can become implicitly loaded with shame. It's one of the perversities of abusive situations that targets take on the burden of shame that rightfully belongs to their abusers. The act of speaking the unspeakable works to counteract that shame. For that reason, any external acknowledgement of the abuse, however small, can have value, even the act of writing it in a private journal. Some targets have people in their personal lives they feel they can talk to. For others who aren't sure who they can trust, anonymous helplines offer the chance to be heard in confidence. Anonymous online forums can work in a similar way. It's worth noting that abusers are sometimes drawn to those forums, but it's also worth noting that various recent studies support what many have long suspected, that individuals who perpetrate cyberbullying tend to show markedly low self-esteem. Contact with external support can carry risks. An anonymous correspondent who told me he'd been confiding about his abuse with a sympathetic friend said he'd recently discovered his abuser listening in on one of their phone calls. Some abusers go as far as using spyware. Maintaining your privacy around people who routinely violate it takes some careful and creative planning. Abusers often provoke strong emotional responses in targets: guilt, anger, fear, shame, contempt, confusing combinations of the above. This works to the abuser's advantage in 3 ways. First, targets' emotional responses act as a constant demonstration that their abuser has the power to affect them, to jerk them around, to keep them preoccupied with the abuser. Second, arousing strong emotions keeps targets off balance, making it hard for them to think clearly and respond rationally. Many abusers keep targets on an emotional merry-go-round, alternating vicious attacks with overblown displays of love. Third, by responding emotionally, targets stay tangled up in the conflict and can end up giving abusers more material to use against them. Abusers can appear much larger when viewed through an emotional lens. They seem to cast a long shadow and seep into all areas of the target's life. For these reasons, clinical detachment is an important habit to cultivate. The ability to stand back and view a situation with a cold, rational eye. Analyzing abusers with clinical detachment helps to cut them down to size as targets begin to see them as humans with specific, identifiable inadequacies. It also helps to highlight the fact that abusers fall into a range of very different categories with their own distinct driving motivations. Some instigate the abuse all by themselves. Some instigate it on the direction of others. Malignant cultural, political, and religious figures, malignant scripture, malignant relatives. Abusers also lie on a spectrum from order to chaos. While abusers at the ordered end might exhibit various traits associated with personality disorders, like entitlement and black and white thinking, their abuse is often driven by dogmatic fixed ideas rather than psychological disturbance. Authoritarian abusers demand strict compliance to rules at the expense of personal freedoms. If the rules are demeaning, tough, it's all framework, no feeling. Attempts to challenge their rules are met with tighter control. Some of them misguidedly believe their abuse performs some virtuous social function, that it instills moral discipline in their targets, eradicating undesirable attributes, and, ultimately, building a better society. They treat their own pet theories and personal preference as objective principles. If they suspect some activity, like a creative or intellectual pursuit, leads to what they view as moral degeneracy, the activity is forbidden and punished. Unsubstantiated hunch becomes law. Because of this, they impose all kinds of nonsensical rules, with no justification or explanation. As arbitrary as their ideas might be, they don't bring the kind of chaos you find with some malignant personality disorders. Many disordered abusers live in a land of internal conflict and paradox. They despise targets, but need their affirmation. They crave praise, but question its sincerity when they receive it. They can't stand solitude, but can't bear the company of authentic people. In short, they want to be surrounded by individuals who are devoid of personal needs. When it comes to categorizing abusers, things aren't always what they seem. An abuser might appear to be submitting to the directions of another agent, for example, following the dictates of some tyrannical scriptural god, when in fact they're just using that other agent as a front for their own cruelty. Targets might want to believe that everything would be okay if they could just get the abuser away from the malignant influence. but the abuser is the malignant influence. For targets who suspect their abuser has a personality disorder, learning about signs and symptoms of antisocial, histrionic, borderline, and narcissistic disorders can offer some insight into their experience, but there are pitfalls to keep in mind. Distinguishing between disorders isn't always straightforward, and it's easy to become invested in a flawed diagnosis. If that happens, targets can start projecting qualities onto their abuser that don't exist, and missing ones that do. Abusers can also exhibit comorbidity, meaning they possess a combination of pathologies. For these kinds of reasons, it's wise not to get overly concerned with diagnostic terms, but to keep a rigorous focus on the abuser's actual behavior, and behavior is the operative term. With abusers, words and actions often conflict. The actions reveal the person. Cultivating clinical detachment not only helps to determine the abuser's nature, it also helps targets clarify their own thinking. Many targets are susceptible to all kinds of wishful thinking and confirmation bias. It's understandable, especially when their abusers are people they've loved and hope to be loved by. There can be a huge temptation to deny or minimize the problem, or fantasize that their abusers will see the error of their ways and transform into a decent human being. These fantasies, hopes, and denials all work to keep targets stuck in the abuse. Only when we're working with good information can we expect to respond effectively to a situation. Erasing illusions helps to establish psychological separation. Targets who previously saw themselves as trapped inside their abuser's dysfunctional world begin to realize they're living next to someone who's trapped inside their own dysfunctional world. Even when targets start seeing their abusers for who they really are, it can take a while for some of their own counterproductive habits to die off. But over time, the absurdity of those habits becomes increasingly clear. If targets could see how their words were fragmented into total garbage by their abuser's selective hearing, made to fit whatever fantasy happened to be flying through their abuser's head at that moment, they'd soon stop making any effort. They'd stop trying to reason with unreasoning individuals, appealing for fairness from people who equate fairness with personal disadvantage, wanting to be understood by individuals who exercise control by misunderstanding, being open and earnest with Machiavellian manipulators who have one use for personal information: ammunition. These habits come under the heading speaking a dead language. For abusers, all these languages, reason, fairness, understanding, and honesty, undermine their power position by providing a path to truth and accountability. They take refuge in other languages: non sequiturs, double talk, word salad, and barefaced lies to maintain their corrupted sense of power. An anonymous correspondent told me how her abuser would repeatedly make not-so-subtle innuendos and insinuations. When directly confronted, the abuser would play innocent and protest she was misunderstood. These exchanges were described as unnerving and exhausting. Many targets will instantly recognize this tactic, which is a particular favorite among more fragile abusers who prefer covert, indirect forms of attack. It's so common, it even has a name: DAVO. This acronym lays out the sequence of events that happens when abusers instigate an offense and get confronted by their target. First, they deny the offense, sometimes concocting groan-worthy cover-up stories. Then, they go on the attack by playing the wounded party themselves, reversing the roles of victim and offender. This role-switching element, sometimes called the cross-up, is a signature component of psychological games, leaving the target in a spin. Role-switching games come in many forms. Some games start with abusers trying to put the target in the role of rescuer. They might put themselves down, or complain about other people attacking them. The target is then expected to leap to the rescue, but any attempts to support the abuser are never quite good enough. Eventually, the abuser switches from victim to persecutor, turning on the target, who gets flipped from rescuer to victim. Abusers are like porcupines loaded with hooks, and targets repeatedly turn up wearing chainmail, suits of chunky metal rings waiting to be hooked. This image reflects how targets often invest in maladaptive strategies around abusers, which just get them more entangled. Each of the rings in the chainmail could be thought of as a reflex response that can be exploited by the abuser. Examples might include the instinct to fend off insults, to protest against false allegations, to insist on due credit when it's denied. The problem with reflex responses is that they're fixed and unthinking. They don't adapt to different conditions. In fair-minded, rational company, these reflex responses might work very effectively as social nudges that prevent conflict escalation. In the bizarro world of abusers, these reflexes have the opposite effect, drawing targets into conflict escalation. Unhooking ourselves from these conflicts involves stepping back and examining our own responses. When we become aware of our fixed, mindless reflexes, we can start to replace them with flexible, mindful reflection. We can control our responses instead of being controlled by them. Instead of mindlessly reacting to abusers' insults, we can mindfully recognize they just want to feed off our reaction, and we can choose to disengage. If abusers attempt to draw us into false competition, negatively comparing our attributes or achievements to those of their own or other people, we can choose to detach from those comparisons. If abusers attempt to smear us to reasonable, fair-minded people, we can choose to assert our innocence to those reasonable people and mindfully choose not to confront the abuser. As we start recognizing the abuser's hooks, we can even put names to them. Inwardly, we register to ourselves, that's the competition hook. That's the false accusation hook. Piece by piece, the chainmail of automatic reflexes that previously weighed us down fades away, allowing the freedom to step away from the games. In avoiding one hook, it's easy to walk straight into another. Stepping away from the games means not fighting to get the upper hand, but it also means not making a big display of showing the abuser you're not fighting to get the upper hand, which, let's be honest, is just another way of fighting to get the upper hand. The aim is to offer as little as possible, to display no emotion, volunteer no opinion, just give bland, vague responses. This method of handling hooks is called grey rock, because it's about making yourself as uninteresting and unengaging as a grey rock. But there are some points to bear in mind when using it. There might be a temptation to let abusers know you're deliberately grey rocking them, to rub it in their faces. Besides instantly nullifying the method, this can inspire more focused abuse. High levels of exposure to abusers can mean lots of grey rock interactions. As a result, some targets might occasionally feel a little emotionally disconnected. To reconnect, it's helpful for targets to identify the things that recharge them. It could be music, nature, physical activity, whatever brings them vividly to life. Grey rock might sometimes involve pragmatic gestures of concession. For example, if an abuser compares you unfavorably with other people, there might be times when, instead of responding in a neutral way, you might choose to agree. This agreement isn't about pleasing the abuser or putting yourself down. It's about freeing yourself. Allowing yourself to express genuine agreement can be a great help in ridding yourself of reflex defensiveness. If the grey rock responses are too abrupt, it can attract attention instead of reducing it. Sometimes it's useful to use a variation I call beige rock. Here, the target's responses have a little bit more colour to make them less severe. It might mean using fuller sentences instead of monosyllabic shrugs, and allowing slightly longer interactions instead of making swift exits. When we begin to navigate living with abusers more effectively, we might feel a swell of compassion for them. As their hold on us wanes, we become charitable, magnanimous, especially if we discover our abusers were themselves abused in the past, or if they seem to show a degree of self-awareness and remorse. A word of caution: we are not our abusers' therapists. Attempting to take on any responsibility for their rehabilitation can be the prelude to more abusive games. Some abusers ask their targets to tell them when they're behaving unreasonably. This might seem like a positive request, but when the target later points out some unreasonable behavior, the game is revealed. The abuser uses the criticism to start a fight. When abusers claim to see the error of their ways and express a desire to change, for many targets, it's exactly what they want to hear. And there's a big temptation to let their guard down, gush openly about their feelings, and talk about a new start together. Unfortunately, many targets discover too late that it was all a ploy for the abuser to find out what they were really thinking. When abusers claim to have some personal epiphany, targets are wise to maintain their guard, if not raise it. It's not cruel or mean to distrust people who've repeatedly destroyed your trust. It's rational and healthy. Abusers who profess a desire to change can demonstrate their sincerity by taking full responsibility for that change. Targets are well advised to stand back and stay focused on their own development. Even in cases of genuine change, the ground might just be too scorched for trust to ever grow. In those cases, it's up to abusers to live with the distrust they've created. What hurt the most wasn't the actual abuse. It was the fact that when I finally started talking about it, no one wanted to listen. During my therapeutic work and conversations with targets of abuse, that sentiment's been repeatedly voiced. Some individuals go through life believing that if they ever reported being abused, their loved ones, friends, relatives, or partners wouldn't hesitate to support them. Thankfully, many individuals will never have to put that belief to the test. Sadly, many others will discover the human safety net they believed would catch them doesn't exist. When they finally share their story, their loved one's response is to back away. While it might start to feel like a deliberate conspiracy, it generally comes down to a jumble of common human shortcomings. Apathy. Some people just want a quiet life with no complications. Pride. Some have been long-term supporters of the abuser and refuse to believe they've been fooled. Fear. Some have a sense of the abuser's nature and don't want to become a target themselves. Ignorance. Some lack the experience or imagination to absorb what they're being told. The net result is that targets are left in no doubt. They're on their own. Going it alone places an uncommon burden on targets. As a social species, we're geared to interact productively with others. Through the responses we receive from others, we get constant feedback about how we're being perceived, which, in turn, shapes our self-perception. We act as reality reflectors to each other. In healthy situations, where we experience decent volumes of good quality rounded feedback, we gain and maintain a strong sense of ourselves. In abusive situations, where the feedback is grossly distorted or negating, targets can develop a grossly distorted or empty sense of self. To achieve anything approaching a healthy sense of self, targets of abuse have to take extra measures to correct the constant bogus feedback they receive. The analogy I often return to is that targets are continually being drip-fed from the abuser's poison well. To dilute the poison, targets have to cultivate their own clear, healthy wells. And the more wells, the better. Each well represents a source of healthy reality reflection, through which targets can gain a clearer, stronger sense of self. Some of the best sources of healthy reflection can be other people. Having just one individual in your personal life who sees things clearly can make all the difference in combating the poison. Another kind of human well might be an online community who shares similar experiences. For many targets, listening to other people's stories can be a powerful detox. And it's not uncommon for targets to go through periods of binge-watching abuse-related videos. It's not about wallowing in misery. It's about bathing in the acknowledgement of reality. Finally, they're hearing their own previously denied experiences reflected back. They're not going mad. They're not invisible. There are people out there who know what goes on behind closed doors and don't want to twist it or silence it. Recording our lives in a journal or video diary creates another kind of well, reminding us that the past really happened. Personal interests make great wells. Physical activities, fields of study, creative pursuits. These things contribute to our sense of being a distinct person with our own tastes. Of course, individuality isn't something abusers are keen to encourage, and it's wise to anticipate some sabotage. As a child, I got into drawing superhero comics. When I was around 7, I decided to write a complete comic. For weeks, I stuck to my goal of drawing a page every night, until one night it was done. When I proudly took it down to show my parents, my narcissistic mother flicked through it briefly, then ripped it up. It didn't meet with her personal vision. Abusers often work to inhibit, disrupt, or destroy whatever the target shows interest in. Some targets learn, like I did, to pursue their interests in private. Those who do persist and develop some skills will sometimes experience another twist in later life, when their abuser attempts to rewrite history and take credit for encouraging and nurturing those skills. Sadly, in the face of aggressive opposition, many targets just give up on their interests completely, helping to starve them of their individuality. Digging for metaphorical water can take hard work, just like digging for real water. Finding and maintaining good, reliable sources can feel like a struggle at first, but gets easier with time and practice. The more interests we develop, the more facets of ourselves we recover and discover. For my brother and I, the poison well we grew up next to was deep and wide. Endless psychological traps, outlandish accusations, constant violent rages. We can look back and remember it all very clearly. But it didn't define our childhoods. What defined our childhoods, and what we endlessly recall together with laughter and affection, were the multiple healthy wells we cultivated for ourselves that pushed the poison to the sidelines. When we're replacing old habits with new ones, we sometimes feel conflicted, even if we're trying to improve our situation. Any change, positive or negative, can arouse mixed feelings or unexpected resistance within us. Portia Nelson's poem, Autobiography in 5 short chapters, perfectly captures the confusion of the process. In chapter 1, you're walking down a street when you fall into a hole in the sidewalk. It takes ages to make your way out. In chapter 2, you walk down the same street. You pretend to yourself that you can't see the hole, and you fall down it again. You don't know why. Again, it takes you a long time to climb out. In chapter 3, you walk down the same street. There's no pretending now. You see the hole, and you still fall into it. But you can see it's your own fault now, something you're doing to yourself out of habit. You climb out fast. In chapter 4, you walk down the same street. Finally, you walk around the hole. At last, you've absorbed the lesson. In chapter 5, you walk down a different street. Some of us will eventually exit the abusive environment. We'll start new lives with a strict door policy. But whether we do or not, there's no need to put our lives on hold while we happen to be living with abusers